India GDP before the British, during the British, and after the British. Angus Maddison, a British economist, estimated India's share of the world GDP in 1600 was 22.6%. This was the largest share along with China's share of 23% among major world economies at that time. This data point highlights India's significant economic power and prominence in the global economy during that historical period. The British East India Company established its first trading post in India in 1613 in the city of Surat. This marked the beginning of British influence and commercial presence in the country. However, it took over 150 years for the British to gain substantial administrative and political control in India. According to Angus Maddison's data, between 1757 and 1857, during the expansion of British rule in India, India's share of the global GDP dropped from around 15% to less than 2%. However, India's GDP per capita still increased by around 25% during this 100-year period under expanding British presence. But India's nominal GDP grew 70% in 100 years under the East India Company and grew 400% from the 90 years under Queen Victoria from 1857 to 1947. Although India's share of world GDP fell, India's nominal GDP grew. What does this mean? When the world economy grew from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, India failed to industrialize, and that's not the fault of the British, that's the fault of Indians. In 1800, India's GDP per capita was estimated to be $550, while the UK's GDP per capita was estimated at $974. This indicates a significant prosperity gap between the two countries even before the onset of industrialization in Britain. From 1857 to 1947, during the period of British Crown rule in India, India's GDP per capita grew from $533 to $619. However, during the exact same time period, the UK's GDP per capita boomed from $3,190 to $6,812. Some historians like Sashi Tharoor have argued that the restrictive trade policies implemented by the British weakened India's economic competitiveness and capabilities versus the rapidly growing industrial prowess and surging economic growth in Britain itself during this time. However, no legitimate Indian economist or Indian historian agrees with Sashi Tharoor. India's population grew immensely under British rule from around 200 million in 1800 to over 390 million by 1947. This exponential population growth put immense pressure on per capita GDP growth within India during the colonial era. Queen Victoria reign from 1857 to 1901 marked a period of substantial economic development and progress in India, despite assumptions and characterizations of stagnation in India during that time. Extensive railway development occurred across India during her rule, along with significant expansion of trade volumes. Although India's overall GDP increased during the entirety of British rule, India's rapidly expanding population diluted those absolute GDP gains in the context of its declining share of world GDP percentage over the colonial era. Vital transport and communication infrastructure projects like railways, modern ports, and telegraph networks built during British rule spurred increased GDP and per capita income, transforming India's economy. Additional detailed points related to India's economic development during British rule. The first railway line in India was opened in 1853 between Bombay and Thane. By 1947, India had over 40,000 miles of railway lines, the fourth largest rail network in the world. Indian rail network construction cost an estimated £50 million in 1850s values. The capital was raised in London with guarantees from the British government. Coal production in India increased from 1 million ton in 1850 to 6 million tons in 1900 and 18 million tons by 1940. Coal mining grew rapidly to meet locomotive demand. Large-scale canal construction for irrigation in India gained momentum between 1885 and 1947. Total canal irrigated land increased from 3 million acres in 1885 to 14 million acres in 1947. India's main exports during British rule were raw materials like cotton, coal, iron ore, manganese, and jute. Finished product exports like steel and textiles were very low. Modern banking institutions were introduced in India in the 1800s, including State Bank of India, Bank of Bombay, Bank of Madras, and Imperial Bank of India. Telegraph lines in India increased from 7,000 kilometers in 1870 to 150,000 kilometers by the end of British rule. Post offices grew from 700 to over 23,000 over the same period. Tax revenue collection increased around six-fold from Rs. 21 crore in 1858 to Rs. 127 crore in 1947. 1 crore equals 10 million.